Ibrahim Traoré was not a man born into privilege, yet he rose through the ranks with the fire of conviction burning in his eyes. Born in Burkina Faso, a nation often overlooked by the global powers yet rich in gold and courage, Traoré grew up watching his people struggle while foreign companies carted off their resources. He was a child of a silent war, not a war of guns and bombs, but of contracts, debt traps, and mineral extractions. His early years were shaped by the frustrations of a generation that saw no future, only exploitation in new forms. He joined the military with a sense of duty, believing that the only way to defend his country was from within. As a soldier, he witnessed firsthand the rot that plagued the system. Corruption was not just at the top, it had infected every institution. Foreign advisors sat in meetings where the fate of local communities was decided. Gold mines operated day and night under foreign flags, guarded by Burkina soldiers paid poorly to protect riches that never reached their people. Traoré was different. While others bowed to pressure and accepted perks, he studied history, geopolitics, and the methods of economic domination disguised as aid. He saw through the illusion that democracy as imposed by the West would lead to liberation. To him, democracy without sovereignty was just another cage, polished, but still a prison. In 2022, when frustration in Burkina Faso reached a boiling point amid rising insecurity and declining public trust, Traoré led a coup. But unlike many who come to power through force, he spoke with the language of the people. He promised not just stability, but dignity. He talked about the right of Africans to own their land, control their resources, and define their future. Coup. Youth listened. The elders watched with cautious hope. The world, especially former colonial powers, reacted with alarm. Who was this young captain, barely in his 30s, who dared to challenge centuries of foreign dominance? He wasn't just a soldier. He was becoming a symbol of defiance, of a new Africa no longer willing to remain silent. Ibrahim Traoré had not just risen to power, he had awakened a storm. Africa, the cradle of humanity, has long been a land overflowing with natural wealth, gold, diamonds, oil, cobalt, uranium, and fertile soil. Yet its story has been written in blood and silence. For centuries, powerful nations have treated the continent not as a partner, but as a treasure chest to be emptied. Colonization was only the beginning of a much deeper, more insidious theft. One that continues today under new names and treaties. European powers carved Africa into pieces in the late 19th century at the infamous Berlin Conference, with no regard for its people, cultures, or future. The goal was simple: extraction. Railroads were built not to connect African communities, but to move resources from mines to ports. Colonies were forced to produce what Europe needed, not what Africans consumed. Resistance was crushed, leaders were exiled or killed, and entire societies were reorganized to serve foreign interests. Even after independence, the plunder did not stop. It merely changed form. Corporations replaced colonial governors. Loans from global financial institutions became tools of control. African nations, desperate for infrastructure and development, were drawn into unfair agreements that handed over mines, oil fields, and even water supplies to multinational firms. In exchange, they received a trickle of revenue, often funneled into corrupt pockets or used to pay back impossible debts. Burkina Faso is a living example. It holds some of the richest gold reserves in West Africa, yet remains one of the poorest nations on earth. Foreign mining companies operate with near total freedom, taking away billions while leaving behind environmental destruction, dislocated communities, and barely any reinvestment in local development. This pattern repeats across the continent, in the Congo's cobalt mines, Nigeria's oil fields, and Mali's cotton farms. Meanwhile, Western media continues to frame Africa as a continent of crisis, disease, war, famine, without ever showing the roots of that suffering. The world is told that African leaders fail, that corruption is to blame, while the machinery of exploitation remains hidden in plain sight. Ibrahim Traoré saw this clearly. To him, the real war was not just against terrorism or poverty. It was against a global order built on the continued theft of African resources. He began to speak openly about it, refusing to use polite language for systemic looting. What others called aid, he called control. What they called partnership, he called plunder. His mission was becoming clearer: to expose the truth and reclaim what was stolen. When Ibrahim Traoré stood before the people and the cameras, his tone was not of a politician making promises. It was the voice of a soldier turned servant, delivering a call to conscience. The world watched as he used a word that sent shockwaves through media headlines: Jihad. But this was not the jihad the West had come to fear, misrepresent, and weaponize. Traoré's jihad was a declaration of moral resistance, a struggle for justice, sovereignty, and African dignity. He began his speech by honoring the martyrs, not only the soldiers who died defending their land, but the farmers, students, and women who had suffered under decades of economic oppression. Then he turned his attention to the crowd and, by extension, to the entire continent. Our jihad, he said, is not against any race or religion. It is against a system, a global machine that feeds on our gold, our oil, our youth, and gives us nothing but debt, division, and despair in return. The word jihad, in its original meaning, he explained, is a noble struggle. And what greater struggle could there be than to fight for the soul of a continent? He called on African youth to wake up, not to take arms in senseless violence, but to arm themselves with knowledge, unity, and self-respect. He urged them to reject the lies that told them they were poor, backwards, or dependent. We are not poor, he declared. We are robbed. The message resonated deeply. Across Burkina Faso, young people began sharing clips of the speech. From university halls to village gatherings, discussions began to shift. The conversation was no longer just about elections or security. It was about liberation, not through slogans, but through structural change. Traoré's speech was not just meant for Burkina Faso. It was aimed at every African nation trapped in unequal contracts, manipulated by foreign interests, or threatened when they dared to stand tall. He spoke of a continent with enough resources to feed and power the world, yet denied the ability to build its own future. International media outlets rushed to label him a radical, but many Africans saw him differently. In Traoré's jihad, they saw hope, not in violence but in vision. A vision where Africa no longer begged at the doors of those who once shackled it, but stood upright, its voice steady, its purpose clear. The jihad had begun, not with guns, but with truth. As Ibrahim Traoré's words echoed across Africa, a quiet storm began to gather, not among the people, but within boardrooms, embassies, and hidden corridors of global power. The young leaders' bold rhetoric, his defiance against the global economic order, and his refusal to play by the old rules alarmed not only former colonial powers, but also those within his own country who had long benefited from the status quo. The enemies of justice were no longer just across the sea. They were also seated at home, wearing suits, carrying briefcases, and smiling in silence. Foreign interests, particularly those invested in Burkina Faso's gold and natural resources, saw Traoré's rise as a threat to decades of easy access and unchallenged control. They had grown used to dealing with compliant leaders, the kind who signed away land for aid packages or looked the other way as their people suffered. But Traoré was not interested in negotiations that served the powerful. He was building a wall of resistance, and it began with transparency, resource control, and national pride. In response, subtle acts of sabotage began. Aid was delayed or reduced. Development projects were quietly suspended. Sanctions were hinted at under the guise of concerns about democracy. Behind closed doors, diplomatic pressure mounted. Meanwhile, international media began crafting a new narrative. Traoré was called authoritarian, dangerous, unpredictable. Western think tanks issued reports warning of instability in Burkina Faso, but the greater danger came from within. Traoré's crackdown on corruption and foreign collusion angered elite politicians, businessmen, and even some military officers who had long made fortunes through backdoor deals. These were the traitors within, people who wore the national flag but had long sold their loyalty to the highest bidder. whispers of a counter-coup surfaced. Assassination plots were rumored. Some of his closest allies were pressured, bribed, or threatened. Through all this, Traoré remained defiant. He knew the battle for Africa's future would not be won without resistance. Every time he spoke publicly, he exposed the mechanics of neo-colonial control, the quiet coups, the weaponization of media, the puppets in power suits. He warned the people that their greatest battle was not only against outside invaders but against those among them who had forgotten who they served. His fight was lonely, his allies few. But Ibrahim Traoré was not driven by comfort. He was driven by conviction, knowing that no true change ever came without facing betrayal. The words of Ibrahim Traoré did not stop at the borders of Burkina Faso. Like a ripple in still water, his message traveled across the African continent. Through dusty roads, crowded markets, classrooms, mosques, and radio waves. From Mali to Congo, from Niger to